It's going to interfere, you see.
Right, good evening everyone, and thank you for turning up. There seem to be a few new names for CCS Zoom sessions, so I hope you won't be disappointed and encourage you to come along to others. What I want to do this evening is cover some ground, a lot of which is fairly familiar, I think, particularly if you've been reading the various books which Roger Hellier and I and others have been writing over the past 20-25 years. And what I want to explore this evening are a few almost sometimes fairly uncontroversial, sometimes slightly personal, and I hope slightly new insights into how the style of mapping on the left turned into the style of mapping on the right. I think that they don't really need much introduction. The one on the left is 1-inch old series sheet 10, which is the Isle of Wight, and is famous for the first mention of Ordnance Survey in its heading, though I think in this case Ordnance is actually being used as an adjective rather than as a proper name. And the map on the right needs no introduction, though the sharp-eyed will no doubt note that this is from a copy of some 20-odd years ago. However, it shows the principle of the thing, and it's the principle of the thing which is important. Here is a close-up of the Isle of Wight map. It establishes quite clearly that it's all in one colour, and that relief is shown by a pictorial method known as hachuring. And although it was subsequently somewhat refined, this is the basic method for the Ordnance Survey 1-inch topographic map for the rest of the 19th century, or certainly what was regarded by many people as the definitive form of mapping. Now, I'm going to use a couple of terms in tonight's talk. One of them is coloured outline mapping, and what that amounts to will become apparent a little further along as we go in. The other, which is rather more important for the earlier stages, is what I will call types of colouring. There are actually two types of colouring which one encounters on these maps. They're colouring which is fundamental to the information conveyed by the map, and there is enhancement colouring. And this is demonstrated by these two pieces of mapping by the man himself, Christopher Saxton. On the left is the familiar county map of Devon, 1575. On the right is the wall map of England and Wales of 1583. These both derive from the same survey, and in fact, they both contain the same basic information, bearing in mind that the wall map is a somewhat small scale and has some generalization. The county map appears at first sight to be very colourful. In actual practice, the colour is not actually conveying any information which isn't on the monochrome engraved copper plate as on the right. It seems that early Saxton mapping only seems to survive in hand-coloured versions. This is no doubt the finished versions which tended to finish up in atlases. Libraries. Finish up in atlases, but as it came off the press, it would look very much as it does on the right. And enhancement colouring continued to be extensively used. This is an example of Ordnance Survey 1-inch old series sheet 66, dating from 1838. This is a very early copy, and you can see, I think, that the main turnpike roads have been infilled a rather light yellow, and the various parks have been tinted a tasteful green. I have to say that the background is not authentic. It's a sort of reddish pinkish colour, which is unfortunately partly due to paper acidity and partly due to problems in scanning. And I'm probably going to have what one might almost call a rare roast beef effect, with apologies to vegetarians, later on in this. Now, the old series is a familiar style, and it's usually reproduced in monochrome. In fact, it's very unusual to find coloured copies which have been reproduced. It is also well known for having had an offshoot in the form of the 1-inch geological mapping, which was prepared on behalf of the Geological Survey by the OS on electrotype duplicates of the 1-inch old series mapping. And at first sight, well, said that whilst the colour on the map on the left is quite obviously enhancement colour, and if it's stripped off, you wouldn't lose any information. You might actually lose quite a lot of information if you stripped the colour off the map on the right. Sorry, I think left, I meant right. In fact, this isn't quite the case. You'll see my point of the various codes for the various deposits. Somewhere down here. Anyway, you see the various alphanumeric codes, and as it came off the press, the map was in monochrome like this. This is a different area. You can see the codes in boxes down here, and you can see them about the map here, but it's very difficult to get an idea without colour of exactly what the geological formations are. Yet, as originally printed, this is what the previous map looks like, and the colouring is essentially enhancement colouring. I can't imagine very many people wanting to opt for the uncoloured one, except for some very special purposes. Now, enhancement colouring continued into the late 19th century in hand colouring. A very familiar form of it are these very natty Stanford's 1-inch new series maps, which started to appear, I managed to nail down in 1888, this particular style, a couple of years after Stanford's took over as the Ordnance Survey main agent for England and Wales. And they introduced this very natty style. The hand colouring they had been doing when selling previous 1-inch mapping, but here they raised the packaging into an art form, and judged from the numbers of these maps around, particularly for southeast England, they sold quite well. There's a close-up showing the sort of colouring we've got on the left here. You'll notice that the turnpike or main roads are coloured in sienna, the parks are coloured in green, and the railways are infilled in a carmine colour. On the right is that particular sheet dates from about 1890. On the right is a map about 10 years earlier, which is actually produced by J&C Walker, and is a rather older piece of original engraving dating from the mid-1830s and originally produced for their British Atlas. It's one of their county maps. But the important thing is to notice is that the colours are exactly the same as on the Stanford map. Turnpike roads in sienna, parks in green, and railways in carmine. And you'll find other 19th century hand-coloured maps which follow pretty much the same sort of scheme. Now, this is enhancement colouring, and the Walker map, both the Walker map and the OS New Series Map Sheet 286 don't have any more information in the colouring than is actually on the original plate. I should add that the 19th century convention was to hand colour parks rather than woods, and we use nowadays the use of green on maps to show primarily woodland. I think there are two economic reasons for this. One is that woodland is much more expensive, and it would increase the colouring complexity of a lot of sheets, particularly in well-wooded areas such as this in southeast England. The other is that in a hierarchical stratified society, the prestigious dwellings are those which have parks attached, which would probably have included quite a number of customers for library versions of this mapping. Right, we now have a change of producer and a change of scale. This is a very early Bartholomew half-inch map of about 1876, 77, 78. As you see, it's of the Firth of Clyde. And once again, we have enhancement colouring. There's one lot of colouring for the various counties with Dumbarton up here and Renfrew, I think, down here. And the railways are coloured once again in carmine. There is no other colour, and being very early Bartholomew, there aren't even contours. So we now move on to more mature and familiar sort of Bartholomew mapping, insofar as it's got hypsometric tinting or layers. These two are both at the 1 inch scale. The map on the left is of Barrow and Furnison district, and according to the British Library catalogue, they've got a version dated from 1886. I haven't checked whether it's the same as this one here, which has been in my hands since 1968. The map on the right is the one of their 1 inch district maps for the Lake District, and dates from about the same time. Now, the map on the left continues to use enhancement colouring entirely for the layers. You'll see the railways once more in carmine, and the various layers which change with each contour are in different colours. This is enhancement colouring, it's not fundamental colouring. Now, there is something possibly slightly more subtle here on the right. The water and layer colouring is enhancement colouring, but some of the infilling or highlighting of footpaths seems to be fundamental colouring, indicating particular routes of paths. And this is a new principle. The principle is further pushed here in the first of the Bartholomew half-inch layer maps of England and Wales to be published, the South Devon sheet of 1894. The layer colouring is fairly obvious. Not quite so obvious is the infilling of not only the main former turnpike roads and the main roads like this, but also certain other roads which were considered suitable for driving. In other words, driving, of course, with horse-drawn vehicles. And this is something which Bartholomew developed. Now, the Ordnance Survey approach to colour and so on moves in a quite different direction. Common to Bartholomew and to Ordnance Survey is the production of a basic monochrome plate, which contains all the information. From the mid-1850s, the 1 inch map was began to be made available in two versions. One of them is a continuation of the hachures style, exemplified by the Isle of Wight map, which we saw at the beginning. The other is the so-called outline with contours edition, of which we have a late 1860s example from Northumberland here on the left. Contours can be seen staking around quite obviously. And it is this style which seems to provide for the OS's first venture into a coloured 1 inch map, or at least provides for a starting point. This particular enterprise is rather shrouded in mystery, but its inception can presumably be dated to about 1885 during the directorship of Colonel Richard Stothard, not one of the better known of the OS 19th century directors. There seems to be one of these people who generally just got on with the job and didn't manage to make a reasonable fist of it, and in due course retired when he came up to the appropriate age. Now, in 1885, two coloured 1 inch sheets were put in hand. Their new series sheets 255 and 274, and they are extraordinarily rare. As it happens, a copy of each is somewhere in the Charles Close Society archive in Cambridge. I don't have a slide of either of them, but I have reconstructed the style on the right, which is rather remote from southeast England. It's actually in the middle of Lincolnshire. However, it shows off the style which was being used quite clearly: black outline, water in blue, and contours in red. These two sheets were published or made available for sale sometime in 1886. They don't seem to have figured in the monthly publication reports which were sent out to agents, and they were mentioned in a slightly hole and corner way in the annual catalogues. Sales were, shall we say, minimal, which is one reason why, if you do happen to encounter one of these days, and it isn't a cunning forgery, you've got a most unusual map in your hands. Anyway, I referred to Stothard retiring, which he did towards the end of 1886, and he was succeeded by Major General Sir Charles Wilson, who is one of the better known directors of the 19th century, particularly as he had a second career as an imperial hero and was responsible for clearing up some of the mess resulting from the General Gordon's ill-advised expedition into Khartoum in 1884-85. Wilson's presided over a rather different sort of development of coloured mapping, which was to engrave the hachures on a separate plate and print them in so they could be printed either in black or in brown in combination with black outline. This was only embarked on, by which time there was a medieval archive of hachures combined with outline on single engraved plates. The very few of these sheets, original sheets, around, and I'm afraid this is an example dating from 1903 and two moves away from the original new series with Brown Hills, but it does illustrate the principle of the thing. And this is the thing which Wilson
on the iPad and get it on the iPad.
Now, Wilson is on the left. On the right is Major General Sir Edward Chapman. This is a bit of Hamlet without the prince, because in 1892, a War Office committee was set up to consider the ideal military map of the United Kingdom. The three members were Sir Thomas Baker, who was chairman, of whom unfortunately I've been unable to find a portrait, Wilson and Chapman. And the style of mapping they came up with gave a good nudge in the direction of what we're familiar with today. I've reproduced the legend from the revised new series mapping, which resulted from this in its definitive form. You'll notice it's particularly distinguished by the church symbols and distinction of single and multiple track railways and post offices, and the road classification. Now, the road classification is quite important because hitherto OS road classification had been rather vague, and now it's going to be based on very definite principles. And I've therefore duplicated and enlarged the road classification down there. That was broadly what the committee recommended, though the final version is actually due to Sir John Clarkson, who was number 2 in the Ordnance Survey under Wilson and succeeded him as director in the spring of 1894. The Baker Committee would have gone for 3 classes. Effectively, the Clarkson system you see there goes for 4 if you include the unmetalled roads. Whether this was something he fixed up afterwards with Wilson would be interesting to find out, but as so often, the documentation is lacking. Now, the other thing which the Baker Committee recommended was that the 1-inch map would be produced in colour, or a coloured version be produced mainly for military purposes, although the Dorrington Committee on the Ordnance Survey, which sat immediately afterwards, thought a coloured map would be useful as well. and indeed there was shown a map printed in 5 colours, one each map of the Isle of Wight. Whether it was the whole island or just the part of it is not quite clear from the record. One thing which is clear is that there seems to be no surviving copy of this interesting map. Wilson himself was not terribly keen on too much colour on a map. He seems to have thought that, as far as he was concerned, it had been entirely his choice. He would have stuck with the black outline, brown hachures style, whereas other people thought there ought to be a bit more colour on the map. And Wilson had to think in terms of this, but he didn't actually do very much about it. And I think it's significant that the Stothard maps are published about the time Wilson becomes director, and he doesn't push them. And although the Dorrington committee recommend, both Dorrington and Baker recommend the coloured map, not very much is done about it before Wilson retires. Now, somebody who was pushing for it was the then Quartermaster General, General Sir Reevers Buller, who is something of a local hero down here in Exeter. On the left is a portrait of Buller, which I've taken from the web, which is no doubt how he wished to be seen. On the right is the treatment his statue at a prominent road junction in Exeter sometimes receives. And indeed, it's emblematic of what happened to his reputation, because he was set off with the main force to South Africa when the Boer War broke out in the autumn of 1899, and very quickly ran into difficulties, and he's been a controversial figure ever since. Anyway, in 1894-95, Buller had very considerable prestige, and he lobbied the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir William Death-Duty Harcourt, and said, "This is the only country in the civilized world of which there is no ordinary map suitable for military purposes, or, as the requirements of military purposes and of the practical traveller identical, suitable for the practical traveller." Well, eventually Buller was influential in getting the map, and this is an example from one of the earliest sheets of the production coloured maps. The early coloured maps to the new style seem to be manoeuvre maps of East Kent and Aldershot, both produced in 1896. The only surviving copy I know of the East Kent sheet is in Treasury papers in the National Archives and was supplied by Buller himself. The Aldershot sheet survives in a couple of copies. Another of those is in TNA. This is from the published sheet 287, Seven Oaks, which was on sale in the usual way. It was issued in 1898 and shows the initial style. The points to bring out are that in one sense it's a development of or fusion of the two rival coloured styles, if you like, developed in the 1880s. There's the coloured outline style with its black outline, water in blue, rather anemic here, I'm afraid, contours in red on the one hand. There's the enhancement colouring of first and second class roads here. There's no additional road information, and if you had a black outline one, you could easily replicate the road infills. You had nothing better to do. And of course, there are the hachures. That is the basic style. It was slightly refined later, and the maps were distinguished by being the first OS maps which were systematically issued folded in covers. This is what the military wanted, though what they hadn't anticipated was the effect of changing over to khaki uniforms, but having red map covers, and the red, when it got wet, was liable to run, somewhat compromising the dignity of the khaki. This is from the sheet 300 as reprinted in 1900, and the colouring and the general treatment is slightly more subtle than it is on the Seven Oaks sheet. I'm not sure how far that comes over on the slides here. I'm afraid there's a good deal of pinky background, which somewhat compromises things, but this, at any rate, the 1-inch coloured map was supposed to be experimental, and it was an experiment which seems to have been determined on the basis of 100% sample, because once the initial military area of interest in a 70-mile radius of London had been satisfied by about 1900, the mapping pushed out elsewhere into southwest England, into Wales, and then up through the Midlands into northern England. This is an extract from one of the latest sheets, demonstrating a side-by-side comparison between the brown hachure map on the left, which was never a very big seller by 1900, and the coloured version on the right, with its enhancement colouring. And I've reproduced the road section of the legend down here, and you can see quite clearly that the colours are enhancement colouring. The colour printing developed after from 1899-1900 because the interest in it of Colonel Sir Duncan Johnston, whose portrait, taken quite some years after retirement, I think, is on the left, and on the right is a early Johnston era 6-colour 1-inch map. You'll notice that the woods are in green. Now, one can argue that putting woods in green makes it a more attractive map, but I think the reason for doing this was originally a functional one, in that for some reason it was decided to start producing the coloured map in the north of England before separate hachure plates had been produced by electrotyping. The alternative method was to take lithographic transfers from the copper plates and scrape off the unwanted detail. And whilst this seems to have been tolerable for names and outline detail, difficulties seem to have arisen when it came to the tree symbols in woods. So rather than scrape them off, someone came up with the idea of colouring the woods green. And this produced a rather more attractive map. So once the next generation of revised mapping, the 3rd edition, appeared from 1903, woods in green was standard. The example here is taken from sheet 302, Horsham, published in 1904. You can see on the right is an extract from the map, and you can see that there are actually tree signs in the woods. On the left is the legend, and you can see they did the whole thing rather on the cheap by showing the woodland infill, but not the tree signs. Whether very many people were bothered about this, history does not relate. This is the slightly more mature example of the 3rd edition style, and rather more familiar one, produced from 1904 onwards, when the sienna infill, which had become quite yellowy by 1903, 1904, was darkened, probably at military behest, and probably for a reason we shall fairly quickly come to. But the familiar 3rd edition and from 1906-7, the 3rd edition large sheet series are in this style of a darker sienna. We have a change of scale to the 1/2-inch map. The Bartholomew 1/2-inch map was completed for England and Wales early in 1903, and a few weeks later the Ordnance Survey began publishing their own. The Ordnance Survey were not particularly anxious to publish a 1/2-inch map, but they were pushed into it by the War Office, who managed to, by various threats and cajolements, to persuade the Treasury to authorise it once again on an experimental basis. Though it was another of those experiments where, in order to make it work really well, you needed 100% sample, and the 1/2-inch map developed fairly quickly. This is an example of one of the very early sheets of 1903, and to be honest, although it's been described as quite mellow and pleasing looking, one might suggest it's sort of been anemic and minimalist looking. You can see the woods are shown without tree signs, and the road colouring is actually confined to top class roads. There are only 3 classes of road, and quite a lot of the finicky details, such as the church steeple classifications, which the Baker Committee have been keen on, don't appear on the, and never did appear on the OS half-inch map. However, the half-inch began to develop, and this is shows how the style was developing by 1906. You'll notice, compared with the previous slide, that the road infill in Siena is much darker, and I strongly suspect this was done at military behest, and they wanted this colour scheme used across all OS small-scale mapping, and they had no difficulty in getting their way. Rather more detail is that both the first and now the second class roads are colour infilled. To my mind, one of the weaknesses of the Ordnance Survey old half-inch style was there was insufficient distinction in width between the first and second class roads, and it's not so easy to pick out the first class roads as it was on the previous slide. But for a while nothing was done about this. It's at this point that this chap appears, who is of course Colonel Sir Charles Close. I've assembled 3 pictures of him here, and having come across or been reminded of the affair of Close's medals, which came up on the market about a year or 18 months ago, and having an image of them, I thought I would drop them in as well. You can see the medals above in colour, and on the right in situ, so to speak, on Close. I think those 2 pictures were probably taken practically simultaneously when he retired from the directorship of the Ordnance Survey in 1922. In 1905, he was appointed to the Geographical Section General Staff, and he moved to the OS in 1911. And it seems fairly clear from chronology that quite a bit of the stirring up with the half-inch map style was certainly overseen by Close. How far he actually pushed for it himself, and how far it was due to constant changes in other people in the Army Council and in the General Staff of the War Office, is something which has yet to be elucidated. However, we now move into the Ordnance Survey's layered half-inch map. It's shown in a reasonably benign, though still quite dramatic form here on the Isle of Wight sheet of 1908. It's quite different feel from the earlier half-inch mapping. And here we see it in rather more dramatic form in the Peak District at the same time. One of Close's successors referred to the colours looking as they'd been laid on with a trowel. It certainly inspires plenty of cartographic drama. I must apologise for the red crayon mark, which is bottom right. Unfortunately, there were a quantity of these flaps of half-inch sheet 13 on sale at a Charles Close map fair some years ago, but unfortunately they'd all been desecrated in this fashion. At any rate, in due course, the hill shading element of the half-inch layered map disappeared, and it became quite civilized, though looking somewhat similar to the Bartholomew one in that it has pure layer colors. This is the Irish version of it, which began publishing in 1911 and appearing in with layers in 1912, and Close referred to it quite justifiably, I think, as being amongst the most legible of topographic maps now in existence. Rather modestly omitted to state who have been responsible, I suspect, for a lot of the design work on this, one CF Close. At the same time, the Bartholomew map had achieved maturity in style, and from 1902 it embodied a road classification which had been devised in conjunction with the Cyclist Touring Club. Now, whereas Bartholomew's layers continued to be enhancement colouring, and if you've got the time and the patience, you could reconstruct it on a monochrome photocopy. The road colourings are something quite different, and they are fundamental. You cannot reconstruct the road colourings from a black outline version of it, and the Bartholomew mapping in black outline was very extensively used in guidebooks, not least the Ward Lock series. And one can also find it with some colour on, but not the CTC road classification colour in other guidebooks, such as the Baddeley Thorough Guides. But the principle of the Bartholomew classification is fairly clear. It's a mixture of width and surface. Quite how you translate this into modern surfaces with modern bicycles with various sorts of tyre, I'm not quite sure. It may well be that passable is the sort of surface that nowadays would be worse than the sort which makes your bike, as you cycle over it, judder slightly from side to side due to its stoniness. This is something for highway historians to explore. It's not going to be an easy job, but it will be a fascinating one if someone can crack it. At any rate, that is the Bartholomew style, and it's worth bearing in mind in view of what happens next. We now reach some slides which may be familiar from March of last year, when I gave a Zoom talk on the half-inch map. And you may recognise the rather stern-looking gentleman on the right as Colonel Sir Aylmer Hunter Weston, who presided over a committee which sat at the War Office in February 1912 to consider various aspects of the half-inch map, including road classification. Well, what the Hunter Weston Committee came up with was what might unkindly be considered a reinventing the wheel. I put in the middle of I put up here the top of the slide, the Bartholomew half-inch legend, and I put down here the CTC classification in a particularly well-developed form. It's actually used on the Aldershot special sheet printed in 1915 by Bartholomew. And I've shown in the bottom panels the Hunter Weston road classification. It's actually, if you look carefully, in two forms. The one on the left is the original one, which includes slopes of 1 in 10 to 1 in 7 and steeper than 1 in 7. On the right, it's in the later form as it was going to be used on the half-inch map. And the Hunter Weston classification is very familiar, of course, the 1-inch popular edition, to which we'll come in a little while. So the Hunter Weston Committee gave birth to a new style of half-inch map, and until about 20 years ago, it was thought that anything resulting from these experiments had been lost. But then sheet 36 turned up, and so often with these intriguing maps, we're not quite sure where it came from, but thank goodness it did turn up. And it is now safe in the Charles Clode Society's archive in Cambridge, and you can also look at it at your leisure in the map section of the Charles Clode Society website. And here it is in close up. I apologize for the rather fuzzy quality of this, which I had to extract from a fairly low resolution slide, but it does show the basics of the new style, which is quite different from the Isle of Wight and Peak District sheets we were looking at. It combines both layer colouring and very subtle hill shading. It also has the Hunter Weston road classification system, and the plate is complete. The black plate is engraved afresh. Now, we need to go back a year or two to the War Office's desire for a half-inch map which was based on conventional copper engraving rather than the photo etching method, which had been used for reasons of haste for the initial half-inch map, which the War Office didn't regard as definitive. And it's at this point one begins to suspect a certain amount of influence by Close, because the geographical section of the General Staff was very much higher proportion of its activity was on intelligence gathering. Indeed, it was at one time previously been known as the intelligence department of the War Office, rather than actual cartographic production, as the Directorate of Military Survey became during and since World War II. Now, a rather interesting subtle point is to be found on this Belgian 1 to 40,000 map up here, in which you'll notice the town is named in upright capitals. And this style is used on the Irish half-inch map, and it's also used, if you look bottom right, on the sheet 36 of produced probably in 1915, not published, but on the CCS website. You'll notice the names upright capitals. Now, the 1-inch style of which have been in use since the earliest 1-inch maps, and you can also find on some commercial maps, have been to show ordinary towns in italic lettering, as Morton Hampstead is shown here, and only cities were shown in the upright Roman. Now, on the 1-inch mapping, which was prepared in the wake of the Hunter Weston recommendations, and which would supply the revision material and drawing basis for the new half-inch map, towns were, small towns were put in upright lettering like this, probably because it was thought it would make them more legible. So it's a rather interesting example, I think, of half-inch influence working itself onto the 1-inch. And it doesn't stop there. I've reproduced above a Third National Revision 1-inch legend panel. It's actually a 1914 one from one of the older shot sheets, which were produced before the popular edition got going, but it shows the basic principle of the thing, and you can see it's really very similar to the legend panel for half-inch sheet 36 below. Meanwhile, the style of the 1-inch certainly was not fixed, and I think that also the thought experiments might inform what they were going to do with the half-inch. And so we get the well-known series of experimental 1-inch maps, which were produced around 1930, between about 1913 and 1916. The most celebrated, of course, is the Killarney map. The relief treatment is fairly apparent. I've reproduced the road legend panel down here, and you'll notice that although it has Hunter Weston, now has the Hunter Weston dual colours of red and yellowish or sienna, however you might want to describe it, it is still, as far as the roads are concerned, enhancement colouring. And although it appears to be a radical map, it's actually another version of the enhancement colour procedure, rather than colour being fundamental. And the same applies to the my personal favourite of this series, the Dorking and Leith Hill sheet, which appeared towards the end of June 1914. A version of the style was going to be used on the new 1-inch mapping, which was hoped to publish the first sheets sometime in 1914. In the event, very few of them were printed, and practically all of them have disappeared. This is one which again reappeared mysteriously some 20-odd years ago and has been secured for the Charles Close Society archive in Cambridge. It has the Hunter Weston Road classification system, and it has layering and hill shading. And although, once again, this isn't terribly good, I think it makes the basic principle of the thing quite clear. Now, at this point, of course, we have World War I coming along and complicating things, and we get to the advent of the national coloured outline style. Now, the first near national cover in coloured outline mapping is the half-inch training map, which is seems to be first produced in the autumn of 1914. It's usually in the three-colour style exemplified by the large extract, which I'm afraid has suffered from paper acidity, giving a false impression of a brown background, but it's really black outline, blue water, brown contours. A very few sheets have road infills, as in the example on the right. Quite wise, not quite certain whether, of course, some combination of plates or something else is for further investigation. At any rate, this is the coloured outline style, which differs in that it doesn't attempt to show relief pictorially. And I'm now going to show a slide which defines the coloured outline style and includes examples, which I hope you won't regard as too much rubbing your noses in it. On the left, at the top, is the 1-inch popular edition, which is definitely in coloured outline style. Below is the 1-inch third edition, which definitely isn't, because it's got pictorial hashed relief. On the right at the top is a standard OS 1 to 50,000 Landranger. Below it is a non-standard Landranger. It's the only one which was published for sale with hill shading added. It was an experimental version of sheet 124, which was published in 1995. It's the one with the dragon on the spine. At least 2 other sheets were prepared in hill shaded style. I think one is 160, including the Brecon beacons, and the other was sheet 90, covering the Penrith and the Northeast Lake districts. That is not the coloured outline style, as the pictorial hill shading, not terribly effective, I think, but anyway, has been imposed on top of the other mapping. Now, the other point is where the term coloured outline style has come from. Well, the answer comes from very early issues of the 1-inch popular edition, the ones which are in rather flimsy bookfold buff covers like this. These have a summary of OS publications inside the cover, and they included these words here. A popular edition, notice the lowercase letters, in coloured outline is also in course of publication. Price unmounted is shilling per sheet. The price very quickly went up, and copies of these maps in these early covers without price amendments are extremely unusual. I have to say also that I've never seen an unmounted version of one of these. I've only ever seen them in cloth form. It does make me wonder if any folded unmounted versions were actually placed on sale. On the other hand, up to the early 1930s, the quality of paper used for maps not issued mounted was such they tended to wear fairly quickly, and they probably haven't survived in as many numbers as were printed. But that is the essence of coloured outline. It must not have pictorial relief. Right. Moment. Now we come to the exploitation of the coloured outline style. I've reproduced top left once again my reconstruction of the 1886 style, and here is an example which is dated April 1891 of something which is fully coloured outline, which is signed by the future Colonel William Willoughby Verner, whom we actually have a genuine colour photo here, which I pulled off the net, and I think I published in Cheek Lines a few years ago. So might as well enjoy it as it's there. The next slide shows this mapping, which appeared in a textbook of military topography of 1898 in more detail, and has all the elements of a later coloured outline map. It's got the road infill, the coloured contours, black outline, and blue water and green for woodland. Except there's only a single road colour used, it's very much the style we associate with the 1-inch popular edition. Now, the OS didn't push the coloured outline style from the 1890s until 1914 or so, but one publisher who did was W&AK Johnston, and this is an extract from one of the sheets of their 3rd-inch map of Scotland, which was published between 1896 and 1898. And they were, again, I must apologise for the pinkish background, which I must ask you to try and mentally filter out due to, as I say, paper acidity and light tending to get into the scanner. You can see that the contours and indeed physical names are in brown, water and water names is in blue, and other outlines in black, and main roads are enhanced in dark sienna, and county boundaries enhanced in colour. This is the quite sophisticated version of the coloured outline style. Johnston persisted in producing these maps in this style into the 1930s. The mapping itself was later used from 1940 in the 3rd-inch road atlas, which still turns up second-hand, and it's the one which is the basis in Alan Sillitoe's novel Down from the Hill, where it's used for a cycle tour of the Midlands in 1945. That's the Johnston coloured outline style. The Ordnance Survey were using it by 1901 for a series of war game maps of the country north of Reading and around the Goring Gap, which were produced for the War Office. This is a rather later printing, I think it's 1909 or 1911 of one of the sheets, but the coloured outline elements are clearly present, as you can see, with the contours in brown, woodland in green. There is some blue water here somewhere, but that's a penalty of a dry valley, and woods in green. So, I did know about it, but the style wasn't much used. It was used overseas, particularly from the mid-1900s when various colonial surveys got going. The best known of the series, I think, is the Orange River colony mapping at 1 to 125,000 of about 1905 onwards. I haven't got a specimen of that, but this and next 2 specimens are from the textbook of topographical surveying of 1913, and they show the coloured outline style in full business. This example is actually a US Geological Survey, and in many ways it's a reversion to the OS style of 1886 with 3 colours, with black outline, blue water, and browny contours. Coloured outline style was also used on mapping being prepared from about 1908 onwards in anticipation of British forces having to operate on the continent. A 100,000 series of Belgium was begun, and this is in the full flowering of the coloured outline style. This is produced very directly under Close's supervision in the War Office. There's the 2.5-inch mapping initially of East Anglia and then of the strangely defined eastern counties, of which we reproduced a sheet some years ago, the Cambridge sheet. That's very much the coloured outline style. And this is the slightly later development of it with so-called Egyptian lettering. And this is the version of it as used on the Western Front with a reference system superimposed, which is numbered in purple, but the mapping underneath is entirely the coloured outline style. So now at last we reach the 1-inch popular edition. This is the Plymouth sheet, which is sheet 144, which is dated 1918 and seems to be one of 3 or 4 sheets which may actually have been printed in 1918. This particular style first appears on, as far as I can see, on a pair of sheets of Aldershot in 1914. The 1914 Aldershot sheets are a rather complicated family. The most familiar version seems to be one which is in the basic style, which was going to be adopted for the new 1-inch map, of which I showed you the Plymouth specimen a little while ago, and most surviving copies seem to be in that style. A second style is a somewhat watered down version of that, with the hachures still present but the layering omitted. The third style effectively follows that of the 1-inch popular edition, with relief shown purely by contours. And we now come to the question of why the popular edition style was introduced. It's been suggested that this was for reasons of economy, because it would only cost about 2/3 or less to prepare a sheet for printing in this style, as opposed to the rather more elaborate style exemplified by the Aldershot sheets and by the other version, the Plymouth sheet we saw earlier. I suggest one reason for doing this in the short term was as an improvisation, in order that a considerable backlog of 1-inch publication, which had built up during the war, could be cleared off with minimal effort, and that it was intended later on, at first, to publish the map in 2 forms, and it was only later that the costs forced a rethink, plus the fact the map seemed to be selling perfectly well in this somewhat cheaper to produce style. And it's at this point that we get the 1-inch popular as quite clearly the ancestor of the 1 to 50,000 Landranger. So although that map is about, I think, 1999-2000, the style is that which was current and established by 1922. There are, of course, a number of editions and somewhat more sophisticated road colours, and the blue highlighting for tourist attractions, but fundamentally that is the style which started to appear in quantity in 1918-19. There is a bit of a tail piece to this, and that is the so-called outline version of the 1-inch popular edition, which started to appear in 1921-22. The original version was black outline and coloured contours, and tend to be rather suggestive of the style which had been adopted for the 6-inch mapping from the late 1900s, of having contours in colour. I think that they wouldn't have to be redrawn each time a new edition of the 6-inch was prepared. This seems to be found to be rather unsatisfactory early on, and so a 3-colour outline edition was being produced by 1923, and is the version, I won't say it's the most familiar version, because outline populars don't turn up all that often, and tend to be the sort of things you might encounter or intercept when university geography departments and the like are throwing out. This, as you see in the centre, is a 3-colour affair, which has outline in black, water in blue, and contours in brown. Well, up here we have the same area in my reconstructed my reconstruction. The reason for choosing the area of the reconstruction was that I happened to have a 1923 outline covering the same area. So the OS spent a certain amount of time and trouble, it seems, in getting back to square one. Right, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. Richard, that was a fascinating dash through the history of the 1-inch. Anybody like to raise questions and comments? Please go ahead, unmute yourself and join in. Well, you've stunned them all into silence, Richard. That's
Yes, I remember I had this effect when I spoke on the National Grid and the new popular edition of our AGM in Nuneaton in 1995. I think there was only one question that came from Rob Wheeler, but he sent his apologies this evening because apparently he's at a live in-person meeting. To catch up with the recording later.
Richard, John, can I just echo your comments? It's Chris Haley speaking, and say what an excellent talk it was and filled in a lot of detail. I think the reason there are no questions is Richard's covered everything.
I think there's been a lot to absorb. It was absolutely fascinating and raised a lot of points that I'd never noticed, having looked at maps like that and just not picked up that those specifics. I'm delighted with what we've seen. Anybody else got anything to add?
Whilst you're thinking about it, can I remind you, for those of you who've not yet invested, that we do have 3 books, of which we still have a few copies in stock, I think, in the Society, which cover this. There's Tim Nicholson's on the first, on the birth of the modern small-scale map, which is actually the early coloured 1-inch mid-1890s through to mid-1900s. There's the Hellier and Oliver Guide to the 1-inch 3rd edition, which covers the story from 1903 into the 1910s. And there is Yo Hodson's on the 1-inch popular edition, profusely illustrated. In fact, rather better illustrated than the other 2, but then we were unable to find germane illustrations. This is always a problem with working, but anyway, there are those 3, and if you go onto the website, you'll be able to find details of them, and you might even find them at an advantageous price. Thank you. Commercial break over.
Yes, are you able to say anything about how foreign maps were developing at the same time?
This is a rather, I'm not going to venture very far into that. The main run, there are 2 streams of influence there. At least I think there are 2, unless it can be proved that one was influenced by the other. One of them is the fairly well-known French experiment, the French type 1900 style, which was illustrated by in the textbook of topographical surveying of 1913, which included quite elaborate hill shading and some roads and buildings shown in red and so on. This proved rather the sheets were published comparatively slowly, and after the First World War the style was greatly simplified down into a coloured outline map in about 4 colours: outline, water, contours and green for woods, which is also a fairly standard style in Europe in the war period. The other style is the one developed, which one could call the Alpine style, which tends to be developed by commercial firms such as Kummerly and Fry of, I think there was Zurich or Bern, someone can correct me offhand, which is much more coloured and looks like, dare I say it, a rather classier version with greater clarity of the laid on with a trowel early half-inch layered style being used in Britain. I suspect it's that the Alpine examples may have been influential in that, though on the other hand, at a meeting at the RGS in 1904, George Phillip of the mapping firm suggested a colour scheme which does seem to be closely related to the early half-inch layered style. The 3rd style actually is effectively the basic style which the OS have been using since it first started publishing in the early 19th century, and that is simply the engraved map with hachures, which may be produced either by traditional copper engraving or by slightly more sophisticated methods such as photo etching. That's comparative detail, which is really just black outline with contours. And again, a reasonably well-known series like that is the French 1 to 80,000, which was still being printed in that style well into the 20th century, and the Austrian 175,000 series, which covered perhaps the whole of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in a fairly quick time in the 1870s and 80s, and the Prussian German 1 to 100,000 series, which is, to be honest, not the most inspiring of maps, which is full of minute little signs which tend to get lost in the hachures. And one wonders how on earth they ever found their way about it. A.G.P. Taylor remarks that the First World War was a result of setting railway timetables in motion. So if they're able to go by rail, they would have to find their way around with these 1 to 100,000 maps. Those are sort of three basic streams which are there, and I think you can relate various developments to them. Dutch, for example, have a monochrome series that I think 1 to 50,000, which is produced in the later 19th century, which is clearly of the hachured type, except that, of course, there's a marked lack of hills in Holland, but it's the same basic idea. Likewise in Belgium, and also in Italy. In my well, in the 19th century book, I reproduced a bit of a 175,000 of, I think, of the area around Florence, which is, again, it's this black and hashed style, which is pretty much in its actual style. And of course, there's the best known of the lot of those, and probably the best done, and that's the Carte du Fort of Switzerland, which is produced between about 1845 and 1865 at 100,000, which again went on well into the 20th century, though latterly they seem to have done much the same as the OS did with its engraved plates and separated the hachures from the outline, so it turns up in a 2, 3, or 4 coloured style, broadly using the original 1840s, 50s, 60s engraving. Thank you.
Yep. Yep.
Richard, can I ask a question? It's Mark Simmons. I'm on the Isle of Wight at the moment, and the first map you put up was the Mudge Map of the southern part of the Isle of Wight. It's a patch that I actually cover for my job. I used to be able to look at these Mudge Maps through the British Library website, which doesn't seem to be accessible now. Where can I go? Where are these Mudge Maps available on a public website somewhere?
That's a very good question. I'm not. I've become an enthusiastic user of the National Library of Scotland's website for larger scale OS mapping. Smaller scale stuff, it does seem. I don't know whether this is because there are problems with the British Library website finding its way around. And I must say that I don't find either the British Library or the Ordnance Survey's websites the easiest of things to find one's way around, or whether they did mount them and have taken them down. There are some rather later versions on the website of the National Library of Australia, which I think there may be links to through the Charles Close Society's website. But those are the 1860s, and the mapping doesn't appear quite anything like as pristine as it is in the slide I put up. The maps were used by Cassini for their various their issues back in the mid-noughties, and that might be the those, or possibly the David and Charles, might turn up second-hand if you want to try exploring the second-hand market, which these days tends to mean the better sort of charity shops, the Oxfam bookshops.
Right.
I'm sorry not to be more exact about this. I tend to be still, as far as practicable, a hard copy map man.
Yeah, no, I do look at the University of Scotland for their the maps that they've got. The British Library just seems to be a software problem, that you used to be able to get at these things, and they've done something which for some reason has just made them inaccessible. But it's just a bit frustrating, really, because
I agree.
my work is, I find them incredibly useful for my work. You know, for the evolution of farm landscapes and common land and so forth. Yeah.
Richard, can you hear me?
I can.
I've put a comment on chat, but I haven't seen it come up. I don't know whether you received it. I don't know why it's not come up on the list of messages received.
I'm just looking through. Oh, here we are. Hello, Richard. Yeah, I think it's probably the way chat comes up on these things. Hang on, can I just... You're involved in the HRC project now, deep mapping state archives in which georeference can...
No, it's not that. I'll read it out to you and then...
Yes, you do that.
I note start date of colouring as 1897, but I've seen some county series 1 to 500 with colouring, which may be before that date, but it may be hand colouring. Have you any comment on that?
Yeah, that it is hand colouring. There were both the 1 to 500 and the most 1 to 500s were hand coloured, and this is the method pursued up to the 1890s. There were a few early experiments in the 1850s and 60s with colour printing the 1 to 500, probably no more than a dozen sheets in all, and they were showed rather more willing than achievement. But yes, it is hand colouring, and it's generally in a somewhat different category from the 1-inch mapping, which I was discussing this evening. It has its roots partly in Board of Ordnance manuscript mapping, partly in the practices of estate mapping. So there the colour is being used not for enhancement, but as an essential part of the mapping, particularly after around 1870, when the sienna infill for roads, instead of being splashed indiscriminately and including garden paths, tends to be restricted to what may be public roads. I say maybe because that can be quite thorny for right-of-way investigators, and I prefer not to go there this evening.
Yes, thank you. I've seen this in the library, and I had an idea that it was before 1897, the 1 to 500s that I've seen.
Yes.
Anyway,
Well,
thank you for that comment.
Yeah, the 1 to 500 scale was abandoned. Well, no further revision was done except in a very limited number of cases on repayment after about 1895, though the mapping itself was kept going, was still available into the 1940s and 1950s in its unrevised states, and it's apparent from reprint codes some people are actually buying various things. But hand colouring in the OS very much declines after about 1897 or so. And it seems to be given up completely, even in the very limited cases where it was needed, for example, for the residual 5-foot mapping of London around 1915 or so.
Yes, it was
that's quite
abandoned
different from geological hand colouring, which was certainly going on into the 1940s, even 1950s. Though I believe the price of the maps reflected the fact it wasn't exactly a cheap process.
No, they were abandoned in favour of the 1 to 1250.
Not directly, no. They were abandoned because the OS, as the price of getting any sort of money for revision, had to make various cutbacks. And ironic, so for about 15 years, the largest scale which was being revised was the 1 to 500. Then in 1911, it turns out to be a need for a rather larger scale for annotation for the new increase in land values tax, which turns out to be a right old fiasco. And so therefore the 1250s were produced by photo enlargement and eventually remained available, though again they don't seem to turn up very much even in the institutional collections. So they were certainly being used. They certainly don't turn up in proportion to the contemporary 25-inch maps.
So that was probably in Charles Close's time.
Oh yes, 1911 is when Close takes over at OS. I think he was taking over a developing situation, which would be, he takes over in August 1911, and this business has been developing since late 1910. So probably the policy decision had been made by the time he took over. Again, this is something that's completely undocumented, other than what one can infer from looking at the maps, pretty much. So much has to be inferred from looking at maps and trying to piece things together, not from explicit, nice, neat documentary background files, which do start to become available after the First World War in modest quantities, and rather greater ones after the Second. But as will become apparent when the OS Small Scales book is published in a few months' time, even there is quite a lot which is undocumented, particularly for the past 40 years.
Okay, well, thank you, Richard. I've taken several notes, and that's been very interesting.
Good, thank you.
If no one has any further questions, I think we'll draw the meeting to a close and wish you all a safe journey home. Any last minute requests? No. Then good night, and thank you very much indeed, Richard. Absolutely fascinating.
Good, thank you very much. I hope it's worth all this trouble.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good
Good night,
night.
everyone.
Right.